Very good afternoon, and thank you so much for having taken the time to join the webinar. My name is Jay Reddy. I'm a senior technical evangelist in Managed Engine. Today's webinar is around a very specific topic, probably at one of the most important times in the history of how organizations have been handling IT. Through today's course of session, we'll be talking about threat detection and how do we go about mitigating threat with a couple of interesting tips. We'll be talking about best practices to do threat detection and detection and mitigation. So through and through, what we'll try to do is to understand how has the landscape changed from before, how are things different while a lot of us are working remotely, what sort of best practices should we implement in the process to navigate through this whole landscape and see what best we can do about the whole thing. So one common observation that we can make right now is with the whole remote work, there's this lot of change with respect to how IT is handling the perimeter. And back in the day, the perimeter was very clear and well defined. We were just talking about how network security is important. But now, as we go forward, that has completely changed. We are talking about how identities are taking center stage. Now, as we speak in my organization, we've got almost about 8,000 employees who are working all from home, with almost about all of them logging in remotely and logging in from 6 different countries at a time. So that means for IT, it isn't as simple as them trying to manage 1 or 2 offices. It's about managing 8,000 different offices when they go forward doing this. So this is the trickiest part right here. And when our users are working remotely, you'll have to understand that there is a chance that they're not just bringing their own devices, but also they're bringing their own vulnerabilities. The threat surface area as we speak is growing so and so. That's the whole deal with the remote working. When it comes to remote working, another equation that you need to consider is the equation where your users form a key part to your security kill chain. Your users, again, these are the same set of users who are the weakest link in your security, who can click on malicious emails, who can end up downloading a package. So through and through, we'll have to understand that trusting users implicitly has been the challenge that we'll need to conquer right now. Now, when it comes to how networks are structured, I love to call it the M&M model. For many, many years, just like an M&M with a hard, crunchy out center and then a mushy inside, that's the whole deal with how M&Ms operate and the whole security kill chain operates. The whole way networks are structured is also like that. By implicitly, a lot of users inside the organization are considered to have a lot of privileges, while any ping from outside is considered insecure. That's the challenge that we need to handle right here. And when we go forward, we'll have to understand that this implicit trust relationship isn't going to work in your favor. Now, I'm going to try and help you condition your entire cybersecurity framework to adapt to this one big problem. So are we going to trust our users? Are we going to let their vulnerabilities creep into our organization? How do we understand what attackers go through while initiating such an attack, and how do we take control of the situation is what we'll try and handle through today's session. The session today is being recorded. For those of you who joined early, thank you so much once again. If you have any questions coming my way, please feel free to shoot them then and there. We'll take the questions as is. And today's session is around 5 steps to risk assess, threat detect, and mitigate them while you're working remotely. That is the session agenda. We're trying to understand how remote users and remote working can be tricky and how attackers are trying to take advantage of the situation. So another thing that I want to point out today is how attackers are waiting for that one window of opportunity. All that they're doing is waiting for your users to make that one mistake. They keep analyzing your users' behavioral pattern, and right when they are about to make that mistake, attackers try to jump in and take control of the ship. So here, while users are working remotely, it's easy to socially engineer them. It's easy to make them give away credentials, and it's easy also to get hold of some sort of internal application that's probably hosted over the internet for the first time, crack open that security, and then get going with that. That is the challenge that we are trying to handle right here. So attackers by default are going to try and take advantage of the situation. They are going to exploit a security hole that is available in your organization, and we'll try and stop it before any of that happens. But Microsoft themselves have come out with a very clear timeline as to how attacks happen with Active Directory. Since we're all about threat detection, let's kind of understand that innately threats are because of two reasons. One, your user accounts and them being compromised, and two, threats that arise out of the vulnerabilities that exist in your systems. Now, Active Directory has been one such identity provider that for a long time has been out there, a couple of decades now, but there hasn't been a considerable change in the security posture of how security is handled in Active Directory. Now, if an attacker wants to like creep into Active Directory and take over, it takes very little time. Once they establish that first touch point, it's just going to take a matter of 2 days for them to crack into your security and take complete control of your domain itself, because cracking through the domain admin isn't as difficult as it seems. And the worst part right here is not just about cracking the domain admin, but what follows. These attackers lie in your system. They wait for enough time. They do reconnaissance to find out what are the critical resources in your organization, and they take months together to exfiltrate data so that they don't like really raise a red flag. That is the challenge right here. Now, with the whole pandemic and remote working, it's becoming all the more difficult for organizations to actually spot an attacker from that of a user. If you were to closely notice, the behavior of that of a user working remotely and that of an attacker seem to be very close. We're talking about users logging in from different geographical locations that aren't home locations, right? Same is the case with an attacker. Users logging in at times of the day that aren't usual. Same is the case with an attacker who's trying to access at non-business hours. So the whole deal with finding and catching hold of an attacker in the act is becoming a thing of the past, because their behavior pretends to be or like simulates a behavior of that of a remote user. And on top of it, organizations are also having a tough time in getting their users to do the right thing. Our users are ending up clicking malicious emails. They are being victims of spear phishing attacks. We are working with users who click on an email that say do not open and download an attachment that say do not download. So it is easy to engineer our users into doing something, and the data also points towards in the same direction. So in the last couple of months, we've had a tremendous surge in number of users who fell prey for phishing attacks, and all of these attacks are ironically COVID themed. So detecting such a threat before it gets into your organization is becoming quite challenging, because the line between what's your user's home device and what's your corporate device is becoming very thin. That is the challenge that we need to tackle right here, because the moment your user uses his home devices or her home device to open an email of this sort, or an email that pretends to be from the World Health Organization or pretends to be from, let's say, the CDC, getting your users to click right only to download a package or install a malware, it's becoming all the more overwhelming to put a lid on this. Now, this is really, it doesn't really just stop right there. It proceeds one step further, and attackers want to take advantage of every opportunity that presents itself. Here, when you see in the country from where I'm presenting today, about a month back, one of the major financial institutions run by the government, in fact, had a tough time figuring out how to go about navigating through one such email campaign where attackers took hold of customer data and sent out emailers to them, or like phishing emails to them, saying that they were giving away a relief fund. This was right after the announcement for the relief fund that the government had made. Attackers tried making or taking advantage of the situation and sent out mails with links or malicious links that downloaded ransomware onto the user's device. So it's pretty simple and straightforward for them to infiltrate or make your endpoints users vulnerable. But here, the challenge is when users are accessing this from their home computers, these are the same devices with which they're going to also access your corporate network. So once the payload is on the user's home computer, it's a matter of time before which it spreads to your corporate network too. So attackers are extremely smart in engineering your users. They understand the business lingo. They try and get your users to click on links, download attachments, make payments. You never really know. There's no limit to how attackers go, or how they socially engineer users to get to do something. That's the challenge that we are dealing with today. So through and through, in today's webinar, we are going to try and understand the cybersecurity kill chain, as we call it. Where do the attackers start? How do they proceed into your system? Once they are in your system, how do they do a reconnaissance to understand what are the important resources in your organization? How do they get hold of these privileges? How do they compromise credentials along the way, or steal credentials? And how do they get into the admin account? And how they go about executing a code, installing a piece of software or a malware, get hold of the whole domain, dominate the domain, and then laterally move to start exfiltrating data from multiple touch points. So this is the cybersecurity kill chain that we need to be worrying about. These are, as it proceeds further, it becomes more and more dangerous. So being able to stop it at the very beginning is going to be the agenda for the session. How do we find out where the threat lies, detect it, and stop it? So the agenda is right here. We'll start by identifying what are the weak spots in the environment. We'll go a little further to detect deviations in behavior. We'll then also talk about how do we ensure that we assess our security well enough and get going with a comprehensive list of things that you'll need to essentially monitor. All that in terms of frameworks that we've been building through and through, right? We've got about 3 or 4 different frameworks. One is the Zero Trust framework, another one is the Carta model, and the next one is the framework that was given away by NIST, the cybersecurity framework. So we've taken inspiration from all these. We've drawn together the common points that make sense for us from a threat detection or a risk assessment standpoint, and how do we go about fixing that. We'll start with the first point today in the 5-step agenda, which is identifying risks in your network. So before these risks turn into threats and breaches, how do we put a lid on them is the idea. So when it comes to organizations, especially ones that are working within hybrid infrastructure, it becomes easy for you to actually look for a couple of telltale signs. The common one that I keep suggesting security folks is the logon activity as a telltale sign. Now, when there are deviations in logon pattern, be it success or failure of logon, you'd be able to immediately catch hold of it if you have context associated with it. Now, what we are trying to do is we are trying to see if we can draw analogies from logon behavior. When it comes to logon, if there are deviations in the time of the day, if there are deviations in the pattern of repetitive logon failure followed by successful logons, you know that there is some level of maliciousness that is associated with it, with which you'd want to go forward, make a decision, see if you can identify a weak spot and fix that. Essentially, if it's a logon that's happening in a non-business hour and the request is from an IP address that was never really tagged in your network, you'd immediately know that there's a deviation in the logon behavior. And so is the case with modifications that are done right after that. How can you stop a user or an attacker from proceeding and making privilege changes or making changes to the GPO? So such deviations can be immediately spotted and notified. And admin accounts are a classic case. So tracking logon activity on admin accounts, especially the ones that are dormant, is very, very important. Most of the times it is unfortunate that in many cases, organizations do not really keep a tab on inactive accounts. Essentially, if it's a rogue insider, they already have access to such corporate information that can give them that edge. And if the rogue insiders who left the organization, becomes all the more easy for them to do backdoor access with these inactive accounts. And these inactive accounts can come back to haunt you, because I call them zombie accounts. The moment you do not have a tracking mechanism on these accounts, attackers are going to eye right at the target, which is these inactive accounts, to get their way into your organization. So as a best practice, I would recommend you to start looking at your environment seriously. And if you have any inactive accounts, have them cleaned up. If there are any regulations or requirements that require you to have these inactive accounts quarantined, please do this. At least rename the inactive accounts and do not make them quite obvious. Don't make them look like accounts that have privileges. Please rename them and make them unidentifiable. That is one request that I have for you. The next one is a tricky one. It can work in your favor very much, where we set a trap for the attackers. since we are talking about threat detection and mitigation, an easy way to do is to find out who exactly is interested, if it's an insider trying to access these administrator accounts that are inactive, or an external user who has information, an attacker who's trying to get into your network with these accounts. You can set what's called honeypot, where we try and create accounts that are pretend accounts that seem to be like the admin account with the name and the whole formatting and all of that, but really do not have any credentials. So these pretend accounts are monitored for access, and if someone ends up accessing or trying to make a logon attempt, you'd get notified immediately. So that's a quick tip for you today. And through, it's not just about tracking privileges, but also tracking activity or behavior along those lines. If there are unusual volume of activity in terms of velocity, in terms of quantity, you need to be notified right away. Again, account lockouts are a great way to look at as a telltale sign, because these are one of the first lines of defense for your security. If there are innumerable account lockouts and all of them are triggered from a single IP address, that means there's definitely an attacker who's lurking in your system trying to get hold of accounts, trying to compromise credentials, maybe through a password spray attack. So you get notified right away. So the whole deal with identifying threats is the first part of our 5-step plan to mitigate and mitigate threats in your organization. So start with identification, look for telltale signs, see if you can get hold of the situation and stop the attacker before they can proceed any further. So in the kill chain, we are at the first level right now. And if you're able to spot an attacker at this level, it makes it a lot more easy for us in reducing the impact or putting a lid on the whole situation. Now, when you go about doing it, there are a couple of best practices to do this. You start by end-to-end monitoring of all these devices and all these entities that are looped into your network. We talk about the when, where, how, what, and why of things. We try to factor in the attributes or entities such as workstations, domain controllers, servers, applications, ones that are both internal and web-facing, your network, your VPN, your firewall. You try to take everything under control, try to monitor everything. And if there are any weak spots, you get reported right away. And in fact, BYOD devices will also be a part of this whole factoring in that we're talking about while we're trying to identify any deviation. But if you were to do it manually, it can get a little tricky, because we're talking about event logs and logs from multiple other sources. You have to crunch all of that. You have to consolidate all of that. You have to try and make sense by correlating all of that. Manually doing it is quite a challenge, and it might take days together just to piece one useful insight. Rather, look for a SIEM solution that can crunch all of these data, get context, give you an idea that is correlated, not just individual one-off events, but correlated, and gives you a dashboard saying, okay, fine, here are your weak spots. These are the potential targets for attackers, and how do you have them tracked? How do you put a lid on an attack before it can go any further? That's the kind of environment that you need to be working with. So the first part of today's session in the 5-step plan is to being able to identify a threat while it becomes before it becomes any bigger. So being able to identify it with the telltale signs and with a monitoring solution is the first step. The second step is to detect patterns that can essentially mean that these are threats in terms of volume of activity, in terms of unusual permission changes that are being requested for. And if you can correlate all of this with logon behavior, you not just get the security detail, but also details pertaining to user behavior itself. So how do we go about detecting such changes is what I want to point out. Since today's webinar, we want to take logon activity tracking as a best practice, as the baseline. I'm going to give you a couple of examples with respect to how logon can be used in your favor to detect such deviations. So here, if you see, brute force attacks are a common thing essentially with organizations that rely on Active Directory as first line of their security, or passwords as their first line of security. Now, if I were to break down a brute force attack from a logon behavior standpoint, it's pretty straightforward. Repeated logon failures followed by one successful logon, all of this happening in a very short span of time. It is obviously the recipe for a brute force attack. Now, When you want to stop it, when you want to have a kill chain initiated, you will have to have a threat response system in place. One that can use logon behavior as a flagging mechanism and initiate the threat response system automatically. The moment your system flags this, there has to be a response going out. That's how you do it. You go a little further, also use logon behavior to track activities that are happening in non-business hours. Most of these attacks that we keep hearing are the ones that occur while no one is around. So again, your system needs to be able to act on this ASAP, use logon activity to calculate what is a malicious intended access. Non-business hours are fine. While working remotely, users are going to access your system in non-business hour. But what behavior follows is what I'm concerned about. So access to other resources, access to critical servers, and if there are first-time accesses, you need to be notified right away. And remote desktop activity, at a given point in time, you should have a visibility into who are all the users who are logged in at this very given point in time. Can I detect that? Can I have a bird's eye view? Can I like kick them out if I think there's a deviation in behavior or if they're a potential attacker? If there are remote desktop requests that are coming in from IP addresses and devices that are never really mapped, that were never really a part of my network, can I really detect that, use intelligence in my favor and stop them? That's the question that you need to be asking. And logon activity monitoring with context really helps right there. So detecting remote desktop attacks can be quite simple if we have a system to monitor logon activity and deviations in it. And a classic case of what attackers do, which is island hopping, they do not want to stop with just one device. They want to try and exfiltrate data. So they'll try and infiltrate into your organization and expand their foothold as much as possible. Even while discussing the kill chain a while back, we saw how right after they get in, all they want to do is expand till they get hold of more privileged accounts so that they have unlimited access into your organization. So there are a couple of tools, interestingly, that can help you figure out how is your network configured. One of them is called Infection Monkey. Please do not run it in your actual environment. If you have a sandbox or if you have a virtual environment, a test environment, you can very much run the Infection Monkey tool. It's an island hopping tool. It kind of gives you a lot of information on where are your vulnerable weak spots. In most of the cases, if there are any nested group memberships that an attacker can exploit, you'd be able to figure that out and fix that right away. So island hopping is how attackers roll. They want to get more access into your system. They try, initiate that attack, configure your users to get to click a link or socially engineer your users to get to click a link, get that first foothold, get into your Active Directory. All they want to do is do a reconnaissance to find out where your administrator lies. And it's pretty easy and straightforward for attackers to crack through Active Directory, isn't it? We know how simple and straightforward is it for an attacker to do a quick LDAP injection, get hold of all the data of all the users in your organization with just read privileges that the domain users have. So it is quite the challenge because you can't really stop them from going any further once they are in your network. That is the challenge. So we want to identify all of this while it happens, and hence we want to have user behavior analytics right here. I'll talk about that in a bit. So attackers try to initiate a foothold, they try to grab hold of more accounts, they try to use whatever resource that comes their way, get hold of the domain admin, and even before you know, your entire security is down. So that's why it is important that we are able to catch hold of such an attack while it is under action, and hence it makes sense to have and detect such behavior using user behavior analytics. Before this threat becomes a big time breach, you would want to fix these vulnerabilities, or you would want to at least be prepared for such a movement or an attack where you have UBA working in your favor. So user behavior analytics essentially is machine learning powered. It takes into account the behavior of the user from the past. It tries to draw a risk profile for the user based on what sort of interactions have they had in the past. If there are any deviations from normal behavior, you get notified right away. Now we're talking about the machine learning algorithm trying to factor in a lot of biometric factors like the location, like the time of the day, like the device from where they are accessing, the IP reputation, the network timeline. Every aspect of it gets factored in while creating a risk profile for a user. It's very contextual and it is historical, so there's no chance that you can go wrong right here. It's smarter than threshold based alerting. Right when there are deviations in terms of, let's say, access patterns with respect to velocity or volume, you get notified right away. Right when there are deviations in terms of biometrics and the time or the nature of behavior, you get notified. If the first time access is done, you get again notified too. So through and through, you will be able to detect a threat before it becomes a breach on the go, because you have UBA working in your favor that can call out a deviation of this sort. So here, if you see, my system is calling out immediately the moment it realizes that there's an unusual logon activity that is going on. So this wasn't really expected. A user who's supposed to log in from, let's say, 10 a.m. in the morning to 7 p.m. in the evening, all of a sudden is logging in at 5 a.m. in the morning. Why is this a problem? Because this isn't usual behavior, and the user isn't just stopping with that access, but trying to access more systems, and in the process, locking out a couple of accounts, leaving behind a few logon failures. That all backtraces to just one IP address. So this means an attacker has somehow gained access to one of these corporate accounts and is using that account or that system or that endpoint. From that instance, they are going further to make more lateral movements, trying to capture more accounts. So you will be able to detect a lateral movement as it occurs in your system. And what do they do in the kill chain? We figure that when they laterally move and establish more foothold, they'll want to like install a payload in as many number of devices as possible. So you'd also be able to stop a program from first time execution with a privilege of a user who's never really installed a program, or on a server or a file or a folder that's never really had any programs run in it. So you can find such deviations and immediately call it out and stop them on the go. So that's how you thwart that bit of it. And yes, you'll want to track privilege abuse too. So attackers target or eye at all accounts with privileges. That's how they roll. So being able to track deviations in usage of privilege is definitely a superpower you need right now. With whole remote working, privileged accounts have to be monitored even closer than ever before. With credential steering and other practices that organizations and users and organizations generally have, administrators and cybersecurity folk are having a tough time monitoring this. But still, having user behavior analytics can essentially stop that, because it gives you context right here saying this user J, who never really used this privilege to perform this user management activity, where J's average is 0, has performed 10 plus user management activities, all changes done to users group membership. And that is a deviation that I want you to notice. That's how the system communicates to you. It gives you context at that level. So the second step in today's session was about detection, and how do you go about doing it is through user behavior analytics. We started talking about identification with telltale signs. We just spoke about detection, where we can detect it with a system called user behavior analytics. We'll get to the next part of it, where we try to assess what are we working with at this point in time. When it comes to reconnaissance, attackers get into your system. They go all through your system, find out where your critical resources lie, where is the money, where is the place where they'd want to target and get hold of accounts, and then that's where they initiate these attacks. So being able to audit and keep tab on how are these attackers progressing into your network is definitely something that you need to consider. So logon activity is something that I just pointed out. And when you're trying to do a root cause analysis right after an attack, there are two phases, right? Once an attack initiates, you want to contain it ASAP. But in some cases where an attack is done within a couple of minutes, right? A few ransomware attacks exist only for 5 minutes and they cause a huge deal of damage in your organization. So what do? You need root cause analysis. You need data to backtrack. You need to find out where did the attacker enter from and see what all you need to seal off. So there comes the part where you need auditing done right and assessment done right. When it comes to native tools and how they do, they have a lot of innate restrictions with respect to how long can they log the audit data, but you want to go a little beyond and look at tracking them and keeping data at least for a year. Look for solutions that do that for you. So in the process, when you're trying to do an audit, these are the objectives that you need to have in mind. I have a list of 25 event categories that you can monitor and audit while working remotely. I've listed just the first 5 of it. I'll be giving you my email address and you can write to me towards the end of the webinar for the rest of the 25. So here, when it comes to log on activity monitoring, we just understood how important it is for us to be able to call out a brute force attack or an island hopping. Group membership changes, again, events 4728, 4732, and 56 help you determine changes that are done to privileges of users and their groups. And account lockouts, again, from a very operational standpoint, are the first line of defense in most cases. And if it's a password spray attack or a logon failure or repeated logon failures because of any form of automated attack, you'd be able to use account logout data to find what's the reason, where's the source, and pinpoint uh, an attacker in the process. And object and file access, again, is 4663, which will help you have file integrity monitoring in check. If there are deviations in access behaviors, if there are requests that are unnecessary, if there are failed file access attempts, you get all of that data right away and use it to your advantage to stop an attacker. And the last bit of it is event log clearance. This is the 25th one in the list of 20 event IDs, the first 4 ones right here, and then the 25th one. For the rest of them, just write to me. I'll share the entire list. So event log clearance is what attackers love doing. Right after they are done with their job, they want to clear their track. So even when they clear their track, they do eventually leave a breadcrumb, which is what you'd want to be notified of. So mostly this is the last step in the kill chain. Right after everything is done, they try to clear their event log so that administrators have a tough time finding out what really happened. So this is a definite telltale sign and a giveaway when you're trying to do an assessment in your organization post an attack. So these are a couple of points that I wanted you to know. Event IDs that you can track and monitor while working remotely to prevent a threat from becoming any big. So what we want to build is a comprehensive list of what exists in your system. We'll start with human error, because again, in most cases, it's not just cyber attacks that we are worried about. It's also very much about what organizations are going through with respect to a malicious intent or an accidental intent with respect to human error. And through, we have cyber attacks that are taking over organizations and ending up making them pay millions in ransom. That's a problem. And then there's always hardware failure. So here I'd want you to understand your network, see where and what you can fix, and how do you build a comprehensive list in your network, and how do you go forward spotting any such deviations. So being able to build what are the risks in your network is essentially the way to go about detecting a threat and mitigating a threat, because you don't want to give them opportunities. If there are rogue intentional accesses, you get notified out of the box. You have out of the box reports that help you monitor both AD and Active Directory activities and get notified right away. Privilege modifications that are done for groups, security groups, users added to a group, removed from a group, context at every level is what you've got here again. And integrity from terms of files being moved, files being renamed, permissions being altered, the whole deal of failure and success of attempts. You know everything end to end, and you can monitor integrity that way. So doesn't just really stop right there, because you need to know that you are always under the lookout. And if there are also users who are being locked out, you need to get notified through and through. So the next step with which we'll proceed is how we protect it. We've just seen a couple of use cases, interesting ones, where I try to build a comprehensive list of risks in my network, and I have all of them tracked. So I build a list of risks, and I have all these risks tracked with out of the box reporting, right? The last part of it is essentially how do you go about protecting your organization right here, which is through a strategy that is proactive. I have a couple of points right here, all of them around what we discussed through today's session. The last one, while we were talking about account lockout, right? Account lockouts can be that first line of defense that you definitely want to have in place, but most of the times it is overwhelming to handle the sheer volume of account lockouts while working remotely. So you can have that very much handled with the account lockout analyzer. So here you can spot anomalies in behavior, you'd be able to resolve them right away as they occur, because it's not just about stale credentials or forgetful users. There could be multiple other reasons for account lockouts, and while you analyze that, you get to the bottom of it and fix it once and for all. So any future account lockout will essentially be a security indicator of compromise, and that's how you deal with account lockout analysis and not make it one more help desk burden. That's how we want to go forward with account lockout analysis. And yes, while we are dealing with password security, while we are dealing with identity security, you'll need to understand that there are innate challenges with how systems are configured. Now, Active Directory has had password policies that haven't changed in the last 2 decades. And attackers, on the other hand, have had all the time to build tools, to build resources that can help them exfiltrate data, infiltrate, and crack open accounts. It's that easy. So let's at least fix the problems that are obvious to us and to the attackers, which is password security. So fixing problems like dictionary words, stopping users from using dictionary words, stopping users from using predictable patterns, getting them not to use passwords that have been compromised already, or using the same password across accounts. All of these are factors that you can take into consideration. So you'll want to implement a solution that can sit on top of your existing identity provider and strengthen that with a password policy strengthener that can stop these obvious attacks: password spray attack, a dictionary attack, and injection. All of that can be stopped if you have these factors in place. And beyond that, if you want to go one step further, you can also have and look for integrations like the one that I'm just pointing out. The Have I Been Pwned, these guys, they do a pretty good job in going all the way to list all that is there outside in the internet, all sorts of attacks that were happened in the past, credentials that were compromised in the past, have them all put together in the one platform. And if your users are trying to use any credentials from that compromised list, you will not be able to go any further, or the users will not be able to go any further using those credentials that were already compromised. So through and through, we're looking at a password security posture where users can never really use weak passwords of this sort, and making it difficult for attackers to crack into your system. So this is another step in your mitigation strategy. A way of foolproofing, in my point, is multi-factor authentication. I always recommend administrators to MFA right away, right when they have a system in place. You can't assume that trust is implicit. No matter how many layers of authentication users go through, you will have to have a micro segmentation done within your organization resource. Granting trust for one does not mean granting trust for everyone. So you will need to understand that. And especially when it comes to administrator accounts that have the keys to the kingdom, here's what happens when an attacker compromises the credential. They try to log in to the administrator account, but turns out they hit a wall. And in this wall, it's about verifying the administrator account with a second factor that's very personal to the administrator alone. A verification code gets sent to the admin email address. It could be another factor like a biometric factor or thumbprint or a face ID, any of the factors that are pretty new, straightforward, and flexible. While working remotely, it makes all the more sense to use such a factor, because we want to reduce friction as much as possible, and users also are going to have an easy access to all these resources while they have multi-factor authentication helping them access that securely. So that's the idea with which we want to trade forward. MFA can be the deal maker for you while you're trying to prevent credential compromise or prevent the impact of a credential compromise. And along the way, if you can scale things up a little bit, since we're already having and working with user behavior analytics, it makes sense to use the same analytics data to also determine access to users. That's where adaptive authentication steps in. So you'd be able to stop users real time when there's a deviation, and if they are attackers and not your users really, because you have context data saying that there's a deviation in behavior. Jay, the user who usually logs in from India from this point in time, all of a sudden is making a request from Nigeria at a time that Jay never really logged in at 3 a.m. in the morning, and is requesting access for a file or a folder that he or she never really wanted. So that's the challenge right here. and you'd be able to call that out with adaptive authentication or UBA, and adaptive authentication can step in, understand these contexts, and stop the user from going any further with a few extra security questions. In fact, adaptive authentication can stop them from proceeding any further and contain their activity to assess based on the policies that you set. So the way how we see future operating, where we keep hearing about a passwordless future, is through adaptive authentication. So we kind of understood a couple of points around how do you prevent and mitigate an attack. But what if you go through an attack? What do you do? What's the worst thing that can happen if you have backup data? There is quite there are quite a number of reasons why you'd be concerned, especially with compliance regulations in place with respect to PII and PHI and EHR, all that being handled carefully. But still, from a reputation standpoint, from getting the business back on track ASAP standpoint, having a recovery plan and one that works in your favor is definitely important. So do put together a disaster recovery plan while you're dealing with threats, detecting them and trying to mitigate them. And a disaster recovery plan should have a data recovery strategy where you use this rule. My constant recommendation is the 3-2-1 rule for all security folks with who I work. The 3-2-1 backup rule is kind of a foolproofing mechanism where even if your data is lost in a ransomware or some sort of physical calamity or a hardware failure, it handles almost all cases effortlessly because there are 3 copies of every data that you make, 2 of which you store in different physical formats, and one of it you store in a different geographic location itself. It could be an offsite storage platform, or it could definitely be the cloud too. But the 3-2-1 rule does work in your favor when you're trying to do a recovery and you have all the way going, trying to foolproof right after an attack, trying to get back on your feet ASAP. So here we're talking about a disaster recovery plan. We've understood that threats are a reality. We've understood that they can get into your organization. We're trying our best to keep them at bay, but still, if something goes wrong, you have a disaster recovery plan that's well tested, that's run a couple of mock runs, that has all stakeholder sign-ins, that has clear documentation saying how do you respond for a specific type of threat or an attack. All of this has to be documented because most cases, right after an attack, what organizations go through is a panic attack. Every user, every employee, both admin and non-admins alike, are going through a tough time figuring out how do they get access, how do they clear off the problem. So we don't want that to happen, and it makes sense to have a disaster recovery plan that's well vetted, that has all stakeholders working in tandem with one another, that has a response plan, that has, if you're working with, let's say, a DRAS, disaster recovery as a service, that has clear, stringent SLAs associated, because you want stringent RTOs and RPOs, recovery time and recovery points that are closest to the attack point itself. So we want to work and get on feet ASAP. This is the last bit of the session where we try to do a disaster recovery. I've given you like a 360-degree view. Where do you start? How do you go about understanding threats? How do you detect them? Can I mitigate them in the process? If I'm mitigating, what are the steps do I follow? What are the action items to prevent that from happening? And what if it happens? How do I get back on my feet with recovery? How do I put a disaster recovery plan? And how do I orchestrate my response automatically? Can I have systems in place where my SOC can automatically handle this, initiate a threat response, understand close behaviors, correlate deviations that are quite obvious, and contain the attack? That is again a question that you need to ask yourself. And yes, an incident response plan can help you because you'd have a pre-built timeline right when you're looking at it. You'd be able to use analytics in your favor, and you can have integrations done to your ITSM tools to assign tasks for stakeholders from IT to get back your system ASAP back on feet. So through and through to today's webinar, we've kind of made the point that the whole cybersecurity landscape is quite evolving right now. In the last couple of months, especially while working remotely, it's become very, very uncertain. Every new day when you look at the news and follow tech news, you keep hearing about new types of attacks, how attackers are trying to take advantage of the situation and targeting the vulnerable. So we have scratched the surface. We kind of have set the precedent to where to go. There are a couple of guidelines that you can definitely follow while you're doing a risk assessment. One such guidelines is the NIST framework that I want you to go through. It's a 55-page documentation for cybersecurity, but absolutely worth it. Gives you very clear cut instructions on what to do, because since we're talking about threat detection, I thought I'll bring and introduce this framework through as to how do you identify, protect, detect, and recover. This is exactly what we discussed in the webinar today, and I've consolidated all of that together in this one slide. So if you want to grab a quick screenshot, this is the slide. We started by understanding how to identify threats in your network, doing risk assessment, doing governance, right? We spoke about protection where we had a data security strategy in place. We spoke about detection where we spoke about anomaly detection and deviations and correlation that can come to rescue. Response where automated incident response and your security prevention, that's right there, all these practices to mitigate an attack from happening. And recovery is where we discuss the three-step recovery process and putting together a strong disaster recovery plan. So that was the agenda for today's session, putting together a strong cybersecurity framework that can potentially help you detect a threat and stop a threat. There are a lot of challenges that are prevailing right now as we speak, and then there are a lot of limitations to the tools with which we are working. So do reach out to me. I'm available for a session in case if you want to like talk one-on-one, help us understand your organization, your infrastructure, and see how we can support. My email ID is right on the screen. If you have questions, you can shoot the questions right there to my email ID. We were talking about the list of 25 Active Directory event IDs that you want to monitor. I have the resource ready out of the hand. Just send me a test mail. Just say a hi to me, and I'll have the resources sent to you right away, right out of the webinar. Guys, you've been such a lovely audience. Thank you so much for taking the time today. The whole idea of today's session is to get you started in the right direction in establishing a framework like the cybersecurity framework from NIST. I hope you honestly found the webinar useful. I'm looking forward to talking to you real soon. My email ID is on the screen. Do feel free, reach out to me, and I'd be able to share all the resources that I promised. It's been a lovely audience. Thank you so much. Do take care. Talk to you real soon.